Today, we're resolving a question almost every student of history eventually asks. If Stalin shaped the 20th century more than almost any leader, then why do so many files about him remain locked, missing, or mysteriously incomplete? What exactly are historians not allowed or not able to say? Throughout modern history, Joseph Stalin stands as one of the most powerful, feared, and influential figures to ever rule a nation. In this video, we're not just retelling history, we're investigating it. We're exploring the unsolved puzzles, the strange inconsistencies, and the unanswered questions that historians whisper about, but rarely publish. When we talk about Joseph Stalin, most people imagine a ruler whose every action was calculated, documented, and tightly controlled. But the deeper you go into the archives, the more you realize that the real mystery isn't what we know about Stalin, it's what we don't know. His motives were rarely straightforward, rarely clear, and often wrapped in layers of secrecy that even his closest allies couldn't understand. And that's where this story becomes stranger than anything you'll find in a textbook. Because when a leader has absolute power, he doesn't need to explain himself. He only needs to act. And Stalin acted in ways that still leave historians scratching their heads today. Imagine Stalin's rise to power not as a steady climb, but as a maze. Every turn, every alliance, every betrayal, none of it fits neatly into a simple narrative. One moment he appears cautious, almost hesitant. The next, he makes decisions so bold and ruthless that they reshape the entire Soviet state. And when you trace these decisions back, you find nothing, no clear explanation, no personal writings, no official memos revealing what truly drove him. Take Stalin's early involvement in the Bolshevik movement. This period should be one of the most well-documented phases of his life, yet it's riddled with contradictions. Some accounts describe him as a devoted revolutionary organizer. Others claim he was more of an outsider, someone whose importance was exaggerated after he came to power. The problem isn't that historians disagree, the problem is that the evidence is incomplete. Whole chunks of Stalin's early activities simply don't exist in the archives. We're left with a leader who somehow rose from relative obscurity to the absolute top of the political pyramid. And no one can fully explain how he did it or why his path was so mysterious. Stalin was a man who could appear charming and warm to his inner circle one moment, then cold and merciless the next. He preached loyalty but operated on fear. He spoke of unity but engineered divisions within his own party. What sort of mindset produces these contradictions? What internal logic guided these choices? Were they strategic moves based on information we no longer have access to? Or were they the unpredictable impulses of a man consumed by paranoia and ambition? His foreign policies raise even more questions. One year, Stalin appears deeply suspicious of the West. The next, he signs a pact with Nazi Germany. Historians debate these decisions endlessly, but the truth is that Stalin's motives remain out of reach. High-ranking officials found themselves guessing what he wanted, what he feared, what he intended. And all of this creates a haunting question. Did Stalin intentionally hide his real motives, or were they buried over time by the chaos, fear, and destruction that surrounded his rule? The answer lies somewhere in the darkness of missing archives, altered documents, censored letters, and stories that survivors were too afraid to tell. When historians try to uncover the truth about Joseph Stalin's regime, they don't just face political debates or ideological disagreements. They collide head-on with a wall of missing documents, sealed archives, and files that simply shouldn't be missing. And this isn't a small problem. It's a gaping void so large that entire chapters of Soviet history remain incomplete. What makes it even more unsettling is that these gaps aren't random. They appear exactly where the most important decisions, the most controversial actions, and the most mysterious events should be recorded. It's as if someone walked through history with a pair of scissors, deliberately cutting out the parts of the story no one was supposed to see. Think about the scale for a moment. The Soviet Union was one of the most bureaucratic governments on Earth. Every meeting, every report, every conversation, everything was documented, stamped, copied, and cataloged. Yet when researchers began digging into Stalin's years, they found entire folders empty, pages torn out, whole trunks of documents missing. And the documents that did survive often contradict each other, adding another layer of confusion. Some historians believe the missing files were destroyed during the power struggles that erupted after Stalin's death. Others argue the censorship began earlier, during Stalin's own lifetime, when the NKVD purged not only people but papers. If their confessions vanished, their involvement in key events was erased as though they never existed. But when scholars gained limited access in the 1990s, they realized something strange. Many files were incomplete. Some were reduced to a single page. His correspondence with other Soviet leaders is inconsistent. Letters are missing from critical periods, leaving behind conversations that feel one-sided. Notes from key Politburo meetings are sparse or heavily edited. And perhaps most suspiciously, periods of intense political turmoil are the moments where the archival record becomes the thinnest. And these aren't just isolated examples. What makes this even more unsettling is that some documents weren't destroyed, they were replaced. Scholars have found cases where multiple versions of the same memo exist, each telling a different story. When people imagine Joseph Stalin ruling the Soviet Union, they often picture a single man standing alone at the top of a massive political machine. But the truth is far more complex, far more secretive, and far more intriguing. Stalin wasn't a solitary ruler making decisions in a vacuum. Every powerful leader depends on advisors, confidants, and operatives, but Stalin's system was different. These sudden disappearances weren't just political purges. They were clues. Clues that Stalin's network of power was far more dangerous and unpredictable than any official record admits. Behind Stalin's public leadership stood a group of individuals whose roles were never fully acknowledged. Some were high-ranking officials, others were secret police commanders, and a few were figures who rarely appeared in public at all. They operated in the shadows, handling internal surveillance, advising Stalin on threats, real or imagined, and shaping policies that would alter the course of world history. But what makes this network so mysterious is not just who these people were, but how much of their influence was intentionally hidden. Take, for example, the NKVD chiefs who served under Stalin. They weren't just law enforcement figures, they were power brokers. They fed Stalin information, controlled investigations, orchestrated purges, and manipulated the flow of intelligence. But their reports often contradicted each other. Their motives were unclear, and the decisions they influenced sometimes benefited them more than Stalin himself. Were they serving the state, serving Stalin, or serving their own hidden agendas? The historical record doesn't answer that. The missing files, the altered reports, and the secrecy surrounding these men suggests that the truth may be darker than we imagine. Then there were the economists, military leaders, and political strategists whose ideas shaped Stalin's domestic and foreign policies. Some historians believe these figures had far more impact than official Soviet history ever admitted, advising Stalin on matters ranging from industrialization to wartime strategy. But their names are often missing from documents, replaced with vague references to someone who recommended a policy or a discussion that influenced a decision. It's as if Stalin wanted their contributions erased, leaving him as the sole architect of the Soviet Union, or perhaps those individuals held influence that Stalin didn't want exposed. But the most intriguing part of this network involves the lesser-known operators, those who worked behind closed doors and never appeared in formal political roles. These people acted as intermediaries, delivering messages, conducting private negotiations, and shaping Stalin's perception of his enemies. They could elevate someone to power or orchestrate their downfall without ever being seen by the public. Imagine the impact someone like that could have. Imagine the leverage they held. Yet their identities remain half-hidden, their stories scattered across memoirs, rumors, and fragments of documents that don't line up. And in the center of this shifting, unpredictable web stood Stalin himself. Not all-powerful, not alone, but navigating a system where influence flowed in strange, invisible currents. He manipulated the network, but he was also shaped by it. Those who fed him information controlled what he believed. And those who survived his purges learned how to whisper in his ear just enough to guide the direction of the entire Soviet Union. This network wasn't just a support system. It was a battlefield, a world where alliances were temporary, loyalty was a performance, and secrets were more valuable than power itself. And the most fascinating part is that historians still don't know how deep this network went, how many people were truly part of it, or how many decisions attributed to Stalin were actually influenced by voices hidden behind the curtain. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin cultivated an atmosphere where no one could fully predict his next move. This psychological dimension of Stalin's leadership is one of the least discussed, yet most crucial parts of how he stayed alive. But survival for Stalin wasn't just about keeping enemies off balance. It was about preparing for threats long before anyone else even recognized them. He obsessed over intelligence reports, demanding updates, revisions, and alternative versions. He interrogated advisors and cross-checked information until he was certain he understood every angle. Some say he saw threats everywhere. Others argue that he saw threats because they were actually there. In a world where political plots and foreign espionage were very real, how much of Stalin's paranoia was imagined and how much was a brutally accurate reading of his environment? And then there were the alleged assassination attempts episodes shrouded in mystery, inconsistencies, and missing documents. Official Soviet accounts mention a few, but the details are vague, contradictory, and in some cases suspiciously heroic. Were these real attempts? Were they exaggerated for propaganda? Or did the most serious threats come from within the Kremlin itself, orchestrated by those who knew Stalin's paranoia could be turned against him? He invested enormous power in the Red Army, yet never allowed its leaders to grow too influential. He promoted generals he trusted just enough to rely on them, but not enough to fear them. During the Great Purge, he eliminated many of the officers who could have challenged him, crippling the army in the process but tightening his control. To Stalin, survival wasn't about maintaining a perfect system. It was about preventing any system from becoming strong enough to challenge him. Even in his personal relationships, Stalin applied the same survival mindset. Every gesture, every expression, every silence by those around him had meaning. And Stalin learned to read them all with an instinct sharpened by years of political warfare. What makes Stalin's survival strategy so haunting is that it wasn't just about avoiding assassination or political downfall. He created a system where fear flowed downward and information flowed upward, where people were forced to hide their thoughts and where he alone had the power to define reality. And within that suffocating structure, Stalin managed to remain untouchable not because he was invincible, but because he made every potential threat part of the machinery that kept him alive. When most people talk about Joseph Stalin, they rely on the familiar version of events, the one found in textbooks, documentaries, not because they're fictional or outrageous, but because they challenge deeply rooted assumptions about who Stalin was, what he intended. One of the most fascinating debates surrounds Stalin's political motivations. Did he truly think that his harshest policies were necessary for the survival of the state? It is a question many historians avoid because it complicates the moral clarity people expect when discussing a figure as dark as Stalin. Another alternative interpretation examines his economic policies. We're taught that Stalin's industrialization was reckless, catastrophic, and in many ways disastrous for millions of lives. But some researchers argue that without his radical push, the Soviet Union might not have survived the coming storm of World War II, according to this view. The rapid transformation of a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse, despite its enormous human cost, might have been one of the reasons the USSR was able to withstand the Nazi invasion. It's an uncomfortable argument because it forces us to weigh suffering against survival, and that kind of nuance is something many historians aren't eager to explore publicly. And then there's the question of Stalin's relationships with those around him. Conventional narratives often portray him as isolated, withdrawn, and disconnected from the people. Yet some alternative interpretations suggest he had a far more complex rapport with his inner circle. Accounts from memoirs and private letters hint at moments of humor, warmth, and vulnerability, elements of his personality that rarely make it into mainstream discussions. A leader capable of both extreme brutality and occasional empathy challenges the rigid image history prefers to maintain. It reminds us that even the most monstrous figures are still human, and that fact alone is difficult for many to confront. Another controversial interpretation focuses on the purges. The widely accepted view is that the purges were driven by Stalin's paranoia and desire to eliminate anyone who threatened his authority. But alternative scholars point to evidence suggesting that some purges may have been triggered by internal power struggles within the party factions, using Stalin's authority to eliminate their own rivals. In this interpretation, Stalin wasn't the sole architect of the terror. He was one part of a broader and more chaotic political war where many individuals participated, cooperated, or took advantage of the atmosphere of fear. This idea shifts the blame from a single tyrant to an entire system that allowed and sometimes encouraged extreme measures. Even Stalin's foreign policy is subject to these lesser-discussed interpretations. The mainstream view frames him as unpredictable or opportunistic, but alternative perspectives suggest that Stalin may have operated with a long-term strategic mindset, one that anticipated geopolitical shifts before other world leaders recognized them. These interpretations argue that Stalin's alliances, treaties, and sudden policy reversals were not signs of inconsistency but calculated decisions based on information that historians today no longer have access to. If true, this would mean that many of Stalin's actions, which appear irrational in hindsight, could have been responses to classified intelligence, internal pressures, or hidden diplomatic negotiations. And perhaps the most intriguing alternative interpretation is the idea that Stalin intentionally left behind contradictions, that he crafted a version of himself that couldn't be easily understood, predicted, or explained. A leader whose real thoughts were hidden behind layers of propaganda, secrecy, and conflicting evidence. This interpretation suggests that the mystery surrounding Stalin isn't accidental, it is part of the legacy he engineered. A legacy designed to keep people guessing long after he was gone. As the story of Joseph Stalin moves toward its end, everything becomes murkier, more contradictory, and more unsettling. You would expect that the final days of one of the most powerful men in the 20th century would be documented in exhaustive detail. But with Stalin, the opposite is true. The closer we get to his death, the more the record dissolves into conflicting testimonies. Missing medical reports, nervous recollections, and gaps that feel too deliberate to be accidental. It's as if the silence surrounding Stalin in life only grew deeper the moment he began to die. The official Soviet narrative claims Stalin suffered a stroke on the night of March 1, 1953, inside his private quarters at the Konsevo dacha. But from the moment you look beyond this official story, the contradictions begin. Some members of his guard say Stalin was already unconscious by evening. Others insist he was seen walking earlier in the night. Some claimed he was surrounded by the remnants of a late dinner. Others described a room that looked staged and strangely untouched. And then there's the biggest contradiction of all, the inexplicable delay in calling doctors. a delay that left historians puzzled for decades. What happened in those hours? Why did Stalin's guards wait so long before seeking help? Were they terrified of entering his room without permission, or were they following someone else's orders? The accounts vary so widely that even modern scholars find themselves debating whether what happened at the dacha was negligence, fear, or something far more intentional. These inconsistencies raise a haunting possibility that Stalin's final hours were shaped not by fate, but by the hidden power struggles that had been brewing beneath the surface of the Soviet leadership. The medical reports on Stalin's death only add to the mystery. Some records say he was treated extensively after his stroke. Others claim the doctors were hesitant, unsure, or conflicted. And then there's the eerie detail that several of Stalin's top physicians had been arrested just weeks earlier during the infamous doctors' plot, accused of conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. Many of the doctors who might have saved him were imprisoned, interrogated, or terrified for their lives. So when Stalin collapsed, the nation found itself without its best medical experts, a situation that convenient accidents rarely produce. And yet, if this was simply a tragic coincidence, why do so many documents surrounding Stalin's death seem incomplete or altered? Why are some testimonies missing entire sections? Why are certain conversations never recorded? Some accounts state Stalin called for help but was ignored. Others insist he was incapable of speech. Some say his inner circle, including Beria, behaved with strange calm, even satisfaction. The truth is buried under layers of silence, and that silence has lasted decades. But the mystery doesn't end with his death, it expands. In the days following his passing, there were sudden shifts in the power structure. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and others moved quickly, almost too quickly, to reorganize control. Decisions that should have taken weeks were made within hours. Files were sealed. Investigations into the doctor's plot were abruptly halted. Prisoners were released, policies reversed. It was as if the entire government had been waiting for something to break, and when Stalin died, they wasted no time acting on plans that had been quietly prepared. The legacy of Stalin's final days is defined by these contradictions, this quick rearrangement of power, and the overwhelming sense that something crucial remains hidden. Historians have tried to piece together the fragments, but with missing notes, censored interviews, and official statements that never match eyewitness accounts, the truth remains elusive. Even the autopsy, which should be definitive, contains phrasing so vague that scholars still debate whether it was a straightforward medical document or a carefully constructed political message. And so the silence continues, both in the archives and in the minds of those who still study this period. Because Stalin's final days don't just raise questions about how he died. They raise questions about who benefited, who waited, who was afraid to speak, and who made sure that certain details never saw the light of day. The silence isn't just an absence of information. It is a shadow that stretches from the night he collapsed to the halls of modern historical research, a reminder that some parts of Stalin's story may never be fully uncovered. As we reach the end of this journey, one thing becomes undeniable. The story of Joseph Stalin is not a closed chapter in a dusty history book. It is a living, shifting narrative shaped by politics, rewritten by ideologies, and guarded by institutions that decide what the public should and shouldn't know. For decades, historians, researchers, and journalists have walked a tightrope between what they can say and what they are expected to avoid, navigating archives that open just wide enough to tease the truth, but never wide enough to reveal it completely. When we look back at the mysterious inconsistencies in Stalin's childhood, the convenient rise of a man with no clear path to absolute power, the suspicious gaps in records, the sanitized war narratives, the hidden hand of intelligence agencies, and the fierce battle over how he should be remembered, a pattern emerges. Not a conspiracy in the sense of shadowy figures in dark rooms, but a conspiracy of silence, omission, and narrative control. A conspiracy built not on dramatic secrets, but on the quiet, steady removal of context. What remains is a figure both larger than life and strangely hollow, a man molded by fear and reverence, contradiction and myth. Was Stalin a monster shaped by paranoia alone, or was he a creation of political necessity? Was he a self-made tyrant, or a carefully positioned instrument in a geopolitical game far older and bigger than him? These are the questions historians are discouraged from chasing too deeply, not because the answers are too dangerous, but because the truth might dismantle the carefully constructed world of simplified heroes and villains that governments rely on. And yet, the real significance of this story goes beyond Stalin himself. It forces us to question who writes history, who edits it, and who benefits from the version we are taught. It pushes us to confront the uncomfortable reality that even the most documented events of the 20th century are layered with misdirection, withheld evidence, and narratives shaped by power. It reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what survives. So, as we step away from this investigation, we are left not with certainty, but with a challenge. A challenge to think critically, to question every official version, to recognize that history, especially history about figures like Stalin, is not a fixed truth but a battlefield of ideas, agendas, and interpretations. A challenge to understand that the real conspiracy is not always hidden in classified files or whispered in secret rooms. Sometimes it is right in front of us, in the stories that are repeated endlessly and the ones that are carefully never told. And the most important question is the one we take with us. If so much about Stalin's rise, rule, and legacy is contested, filtered, or concealed, what else about the past and the present have we accepted without ever knowing what was left out?